In the year 1200 BCE, the most advanced civilizations on Earth were thriving. 50 years later, almost all of them were gone. Cities burned. Trade routes vanished. Writing itself disappeared in some places for centuries. And to this day, historians still can't fully agree on what happened. We call it the Bronze Age collapse, and it might be the single most dramatic systems failure in recorded history. Not one empire falling to a rival. Nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsing at almost the same time. Let's set the scene first, because 1200 BCE wasn't some primitive backwater. This was a genuinely interconnected world. The Egyptian New Kingdom was a superpower. The Hittite Empire controlled much of modern-day Turkey and rivaled Egypt militarily. Mycenaean Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the palaces later mythologized in Homer, was wealthy and organized. Cyprus was a major copper trading hub. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was a thriving cosmopolitan port. These civilizations wrote letters to each other, traded tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus to make bronze, and exchanged royal gifts and treaties the way modern nations do. Archaeologists call this network the international system of the late Bronze Age, one of the earliest examples of true globalization. And then, within about 50 years, it all came apart. The Hittite Empire simply vanishes from the historical record. Its capital, Hattusa, was destroyed and abandoned. Mycenaean palace centers across Greece, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, were burned to the ground, one after another. Ugarit was destroyed so suddenly that archaeologists found clay tablets still baking in the kilns, mid-production, never delivered. Egypt survived, barely, but never fully recovered its former power. And across the region, literacy itself collapsed. Linear B, the Mycenaean writing system, disappears completely and isn't replaced for roughly 400 years, a period historians actually call the Greek Dark Ages, because we have almost no written records from it at all. So what caused it? Here's where it gets fascinating, because the honest answer is, historians still argue about this constantly, and no single explanation fully satisfies everyone. The most famous suspect is a mysterious group called the Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe a coalition of seaborne raiders attacking Egypt from the north. For decades, popular history blamed the Sea Peoples almost entirely, as if a horde of pirates simply toppled the ancient world. But most modern historians now think that's far too simple. The Sea Peoples were probably a symptom of the collapse, not the sole cause. Displaced populations set in motion by something else that was already going wrong. So what was that something else? A leading theory involves climate change. Ice core and pollen data point to a prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean, sometimes called the 3.2 kiloyear event. Crop failures on this scale would have triggered famine, and famine would have triggered exactly the kind of mass migration Egyptian records describe. Populations moving by land and sea, clashing with everyone already living where they arrived. Then there's the earthquake theory. Archaeologist Robert Drews and others have pointed to a cluster of earthquake destruction layers across multiple sites in this exact window, sometimes called an earthquake storm. Major quakes striking the region in rapid succession, weakening cities already under stress from other directions. And then there's the theory that might be the most unsettling of all: systems collapse. This is the idea that the late Bronze Age wasn't destroyed by any single disaster, but by its own complexity. That interconnected trading network cut both ways. These civilizations were so dependent on long-distance trade for critical resources, especially tin, imported from as far as Afghanistan just to make bronze, that a disruption anywhere could cascade everywhere else. Bronze Age states were highly centralized palace economies, where a shockingly large share of production and trade ran through a single royal bureaucracy. Historian Eric Klein compares it to a modern global supply chain, incredibly efficient under normal conditions, and incredibly fragile the moment multiple shocks hit at once. That's really the current leading theory, not one cause, but several arriving together: drought, earthquakes, famine, migration, internal rebellion. We also have evidence of peasant uprisings against several palace bureaucracies around this same period. Trade route disruption. Any advanced society can weather a bad harvest, or a single earthquake, or one migration crisis. But when 5 or 6 major stressors hit interconnected centralized systems within the same few decades, there was no slack left anywhere to absorb the damage. This is sometimes called a perfect storm collapse, one of the earliest, best documented examples of what happens when a complex, interdependent civilization gets hit by compounding crises instead of just one, which should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone paying attention to modern conversations about supply chains and global interdependence. Not everyone went down, though. Egypt survived, even if permanently weakened, likely because the Nile gave it a more self-contained, resilient food supply than its neighbors. Assyria, in Mesopotamia, also endured, and would later rebuild into a major empire. And ordinary people didn't simply vanish. Populations in some regions relocated to smaller, more defensible, less centralized settlements. Life for regular people may have looked less like extinction and more like a dramatic simplification. What's genuinely striking is what got lost at the civilizational level. Monumental palace construction stopped almost everywhere. Long-distance luxury trade largely disappeared for generations. And in Greece specifically, complex writing vanished so thoroughly that when Greek civilization re-emerges centuries later, it adopts an entirely new alphabet, borrowed from Phoenician traders, because Linear B had been forgotten so completely, nobody remembered how to use it. Historian Eric Klein titled his major work on this topic 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, and the title captures something important. This wasn't a slow fade. Multiple independent civilizations, separated by hundreds of miles, went from thriving palace economies to smoking ruins within the same general window of time. So why does this matter now, 3,000 years later? Because the Bronze Age collapse is one of history's clearest case studies in what archaeologist Joseph Tainter called collapse of complex societies. The pattern tends to repeat. Increasing complexity and specialization make a society more efficient and prosperous, right up until multiple stresses arrive simultaneously, at which point that same complexity and the deep interdependence it requires becomes the very thing that makes the whole system fragile. The Bronze Age world had bronze itself, a single critical technology dependent on trade routes stretching thousands of miles for raw materials it couldn't produce locally. When those routes broke down under compounding pressure, there was no backup, no redundancy, just collapse, cascading outward from every weak point at once. 3,000 years later, we still don't have one fully agreed upon answer for what triggered it first. What we do have is a civilization-spanning warning written in ash layers and abandoned palaces. Sophisticated, prosperous, deeply interconnected societies aren't automatically the most resilient ones. Sometimes they're exactly the opposite. If you like this video, like and subscribe for more.